Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone, whoever's there. Hopefully, lunchtime for those who are based in Europe. I'm based in London, so lunch is maybe a bit too early, but welcome. Welcome, welcome. We're going to start in a minute or two. We're going to have our guest Jeroen join us, so just tune in. There we go. Hey, Jeroen.
Hey, Anissa, how are you?
Good. I'm
Yeah,
so excited for this conversation. And also, I'm curious to know whether we upheld our tradition because we worked together for 4.5, nearly 5 years or so, something like that.
yeah.
And every time we would do our coffee round or go and grab a coffee, we would have a favorite beverage of choice. So mine is the tea, the ginger tea. What's
Ginger
yours?
tea. Is it fresh ginger tea with real
Uh,
ginger?
you're 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 exposing me right now. I
No, I'm
ran out
just.
of ginger.
Uh, it's from a bag. It's from a bag.
It's from a bag, yeah.
Okay,
But
okay.
normally I'd make it fresh, but in this case, still a good tea. What about
So I have
yourself?
a double espresso.
Always.
Yeah, yeah. There are pretty decent coffee machines here at the office, so I'm sure some people wouldn't approve of this calling this an espresso, but from my point of view,
I remember
it's
for
enough.
years you'd have that, and you seem to be fine, and you enjoy
Yeah,
your coffee, so
yeah.
good, nice. Well, welcome to everyone who's tuned in. This is a sort of reunion between two colleagues who've worked together for nearly 5 years in the Netherlands. And where are you dialing from?
Utrecht, in the center of the Netherlands, from our Berenschot office.
So I am very biased because I am from Utrecht. I was born there, and it's always my home. But I also do call home London, which is where I'm dialing from. And we're gonna have a conversation about Jeroen's book. And Jeroen, I believe that I remember when I was still working at Berenschot, you like in COVID times that you actually started writing the book, and then I think you just published it just after I left, I think. Something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Just
I think
end
that
of
it was,
2020.
yeah, summer of 2021. It was published. Yeah,
Ah, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. You left mid-COVID,
Yeah,
just before
just
the gates closed in the UK. I think.
yeah, literally. And just before the Brexit deadline, so I was very
Yeah,
lucky.
yeah.
Um, so why we're having this conversation today is that we engage with our members at EODF on a very regular basis, and one of the things that came out of the survey recently was we want a little bit of more practicality. We want a little bit more how-to guidance, if that makes sense. And I immediately had to think about your book because the book clearly says frameworks, principles, and approaches. So you and I have picked a chapter to sort of dissect today in this call, and that chapter is all about how to approach org design. So it's chapter 6 for those of you who already have the book, and if not, make sure to get a copy because it's a really insightful book. And actually, in your abstract, you already covered a few things that perhaps you can just highlight, like what is how would you introduce an approach to org design?
Um, yeah. So there's a couple of ways to approach it. The approach, right? So let's approach it from. Well, I must say that EODF has been very important in my view of how to approach org design or an
Mm,
org design project, because I used to have a fairly limited view of what an approach could be, and that was more leaning towards an expert-based, org design project, where the expert comes in and tells the organization, this is the way you should organize.
mm,
Um, EODF opened my eyes, I guess, in a lot of ways to other approaches, and since then I've well, let's not divulge yet where my preference lies. But since then, I've seen that there is more ways, towards Rome, so to speak, than the
Yeah.
approach. And EODF has people in its ranks that have done great things in terms of bringing that approach that is more collaborative forward, and those have been very instrumental in the way I look at the topic. So that's one way, I guess, to approach the approach, is to look at this sort of continuum from purely expert driven, right? The expert comes in and says, this is the way to do it. And on the other end of the spectrum, purely collaborative, where the organization itself designs, their operating model or their way of organizing. And there's a lot of things in between. Are you okay? Did you choke on your tea?
I literally did. It was not an actual ginger pie.
Dangerous, those ginger teas. You should look out.
I know, it's a good one.
Yeah.
It's a lot
Switch to espressos. That's much safer.
I know, right? So before we go a little bit deeper in the approaches, I know that also in your book you describe how you define org design, because people use it interchangeably, right? Can you maybe just establish that for a second before we jump into the approaches?
Yeah. Also, if I relate that as well to EODF, then if you look at EODF, it's quite a diverse community. It's quite an open and welcoming community, and that also means that the people in that community have a wide range of views on what org design is, and that's fine, I think. For the purposes of my book, I had to be a bit more restrictive. Otherwise, it couldn't fit into one book. So I had to be a little bit. I had to draw some lines around what I consider to be org design and what is not org design. So, and those lines basically revolve around, is it something you can design? That's the basic question. Also, when we talk about approaches, because there's the word design in org design, so we need to take it seriously. And some things, in my view, some things you can design, and others you cannot. And then, taking a little bit of a detour, that's maybe a little bit academic or theoretical, but and when you look at what you can design, then there needs to be some type of artifact. And an artifact doesn't have to be a physical object, because you can design the chair that I'm currently on or the table that I'm sitting at. You can design a car, you can design a garment. It doesn't have to be that physical, but it needs to be something that you can basically draw out or that you can describe. So, for instance, the structure of an organization or the management processes that an organization uses to collaborate, or the roles that they define in their organization, or the authority or the responsibility that comes with those roles. Those are all things that I can put on paper. So if it's something that I can, describe more or less as an artifact, quote unquote artifact, then it's within the confines of org design. So that ends up being. So in the book, I sort of compare org design and org development, because that's where a lot of the confusion sometimes happens, because they both can be abbreviated by OD. So first question you need to ask if someone talks about OD is, are you talking about organization development or organization design? So this, putting it very black and white, then I'd say the organization development people tend to talk more about things like culture, leadership, things that are, in my view, more difficult to pin down. And again, very black and white, the org design people would talk more about structures, processes, roles, things that are a bit easier to pin down or to describe. And that's not saying that one is more important than the other. Both are needed in order to bring an organization forward. But for the purposes of the book, I needed to be a little bit restricted.
And in the book, you also start by describing who is the org designer. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I think in our EODF masterclasses, I think we always start with this question of design. What is design, and what does it mean to you? So it's interesting to have that. I remember the very first time we did the EODF masterclass. The very first masterclass was in Milan, actually 10 years ago. I think we're returning to
Oh wow.
Milan, or at least to Italy, for
Yeah,
the EODF
Italy.
conference.
Maybe
Italy, I
Milan.
don't
Let's
know,
see.
maybe Milan, who knows? But anyway, in 2014, we did the first masterclass there with Paul and others. And we were in Milan, of course, the city that's known for design in all kinds of ways. So that was a logical question to ask in that masterclass. What is design to you, and what is a design? Who is a designer? And in the book, I mean, there's a lot of literature about this as well. So it's interesting to compare organization design to other design disciplines. For instance, architecture. In architecture, there's also someone who's designing a building. But the big difference, I think, is, or maybe compare it to like product design, like Jonathan Ivey at Apple designed the iMac. That's an important design, and his name is attached to it. So there's a lot of architects that are known for the buildings that they design. But for org design, in that sense, is different because usually there's not a name attached to a design of an organization, or maybe in the case where someone who's a good example? The CEO of Hire, who designed an organization that everybody's looking at now. So that may be the only instances where the designer is known. But in other cases, who designs the organization? I don't know. It's not that one individual that you have in architecture or in product design. It's different.
But isn't that also, I think, one of the points when you look at when we'll unpack a little bit of the different approaches, that it should be a thing that different people, or at least a diagonal representation in one specific approach, you don't have to always do it in that way, should be part of it, so that ultimately afterwards it doesn't become like this sort of, let's do some traditional change management stuff and make sure that people do things because they have to, but people will do things because they actually really want to, because they were part of the process and they enjoyed building that organization together.
So I guess what you're saying is that it's a group that's designing. So and of course, I mean, Jonathan Ivey didn't design the iMac himself. It's a team effort, but I guess for org design, it's even more of a team effort. It's even more of a collaborative process where there's this group that's designing something. But in terms of the process that group goes through, a lot of the same steps are to be found that you can find in an architecture design process.
So that also connects to how you can approach it. The question of who is the designer is closely linked to how you can approach it. So can you highlight a little bit what you describe here as the different ways in which you can approach the org design efforts?
Yeah. So I guess there are two dimensions I would like to highlight. Typically when you're thinking about how to approach it, one is what I mentioned earlier, this sort of continuum from expert driven to purely collaborative. Where do you want to be on that continuum, on that axis? And the other is, how many people do you want to involve? All right. So how big do you want to make that group that's designing? So for that first question, I mean, as I said, I don't want to, prejudice people against any of the approaches, but each approach has its, drawbacks and its plus side. So the expert-driven approach has as its big advantage that it can be very confidential, right? So you can have a design, for instance, if it's in the context of a merger or acquisition, or if it's in the context of a a downsizing effort. There may be situations where confidentiality is important, and that is easier in an expert-driven approach.
Yeah.
But
why is it easier? Does it have to do with pace? Like, I have ideas why it's easier, but what are your views on this?
Yeah, so you typically you could involve a really small group. You could say, just 2 board members, or and 1 consultant.
Yeah.
So you can make it really, really small, the group that is involved in this.
Yeah.
So that's easier to keep it confidential.
So instead of doing having a long process, it was with many people. It's just let's crack on one day, and we have a design.
Yeah, and I think that there are only very few contexts where that is really important.
Yeah.
And one is the one I mentioned, where it's maybe a merger or an acquisition that's really sensitive, that people that really shouldn't get out. Even in the case of a downsizing, because I know that our EODF colleague Nick has done projects in a downsizing context where he involved a really big group of people. It is possible if you do it in the right way. So that's even downsizing, or let's say a negative trigger for an org design project, doesn't mean that you cannot do it collaboratively.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense.
So I guess that so expert driven does have its advantages, and then there's one advantage that's often mentioned, but that's not really an advantage, and that is the fact that it's faster.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah.
So, oh my God, a lot of clients may say, I have to involve how many people and how many sessions?
Yeah.
I thought this was something that I could just draw on the back of an envelope. We almost know what the organization should look like here. This could be over in a matter of days. So, and I guess if you do it expert driven and you put, you ask a big consulting firm to do it in 2 weeks, they can do it for you in 2 weeks. But then the question is that really faster? Because you're not done when you have the design, right? You need to implement the design, you need to get it to work.
And you need to socialize it, because people will ask questions, people will not agree, people will also, exactly. I guess the other thing of doing it in that way is that you just simply do not have all the data points in the room. So the people who are the experts and come in, they will say whatever they have from their benchmarks, but then you're very likely to fall into this trap of they call it organizational isomorphism, where you just have organizations copycatting each other, and then what is really your competitive sort of difference, advantage, and stuff like that. So it's a valid point.
I think you could even partly remedy that by having that consulting firm interview a lot of people, do whatever tools they use to gather that data. You could even remedy that, but what you cannot remedy is what you said, socializing it, right? So, or what I would call sense making, right? So once people see the new operating model, then the real work starts, because they have to make sense of it, right? So what does this mean for me, for my work, for my position, for my team? And that's something you cannot do in isolation. So that's something that needs to be done collaboratively. And that is where you gain. I'm preaching to the choir here, of course, but that is where you gain a lot of time, in the collaborative mode, because you may lose some time in the beginning, but you will make up for that when you have the design, because it will already have been socialized to some extent. Yeah,
no, 100%. Yeah, on the mark, we usually say you either pay now or you pay later. So it's a very simple term, but it just speaks to what you said.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
And what do you think are the disadvantages of going from the expert mode to the other side, which is more collaborative?
Well, the thing there is that, and this is also something. Actually, it's also in the same chapter. We did a together with Nikolai Warren. We did a survey a number of years ago among EODF community members as well as ODF community members about what problems they encounter when they do an org design project, and this is one of them.
Yeah.
It's actually making a realistic estimate of the effort involved. Or I guess even the problem is, to make it more specific, getting your client to accept your estimate of the effort involved. Because,
Yeah.
as I said, that example of the client saying, well, I can do this on the back of an envelope, and us saying, no, it needs to be done collaboratively over the course of X number of workshops with X
Yeah.
number of people. That's a big gap, right? That
Yeah.
somehow needs to be bridged. And
Yeah.
and I think in terms of disadvantages of the collaborative approach, it is that time, that is that investment that's needed. And connected to that, it's getting the client to realize that this is needed, and this saves time later on. And the problem I always run up against is that you have to experience it to really understand it, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes a client doesn't go along all the way with that approach, or
Yeah.
says, no, we'll do it in 4 instead of in 5 workshops, for instance. Now we'll say, okay, we'll make the 5th one optional. And then after 4, of course, they'll say, no, we need that 5th one as well.
Yeah.
But it needs to, they need to experience it themselves before they realize, okay, now I understand what the added value is of really taking the time to build.
That's actually really clever, to maybe not be too rigid, or like, no, we're either going to do it, or like take it or leave it, or we're not going to do it, but still keep building in this optional thing, and then making them experience that. But then, it's still risky, because they can still say, well, we ran out of a budget, bye. And then it's kind of unsatisfying when you as a consultant leave and you're like, well, actually, we're so close.
Yeah.
What do you do in those situations? How do you deal with that?
There's no one answer to that. So I guess in my experience, the approach, the basic approach that I describe in the book is the approach that you take, more or less that on the mark, that Amy Cates more or less describes in her books, that so it's a generic, I call it a generic approach. People use different names and use different labels for it, but that approach is really time tested, I think. So I feel pretty confident that a client will realize the added value of that approach once we're in the process. But sometimes it's hard to get that across, at the beginning. I'm currently, in the process of, acquiring a new project where, I'm exactly in that stage where the CEO is going, oh my God, I need to involve how many people, and I need to be involved in those workshops as well. And so.
And you have business as usual, so you take people away from their work as well. So
so that's that's pretty hard. So I guess one of the other disadvantages of the collaborative approach is that it's not so much a disadvantage if you do it right, but it can be a disadvantage, it becomes less clear who decides or who designs, who decides. So if you're just talking to the CEO or the CEO and the CFO, or maybe the CEO and the CHRO about the design, and you're an expert, driven consulting firm, then it's clear, what that conversation is and who decides. But if you have a design team, or maybe even a really large group, in Paul's whole scale change approach, then it needs to be very clear what that group is allowed to do, what room that group has in terms of design, and where the final decision lies. Does it lie in that group, or does it lie elsewhere? And I guess that's the disadvantage, because that's, if you don't do that right, and I've done it wrong a couple of times in the past. So if you don't do that right, then you run up against the wall in the process at some point, because
especially when you're in these cultures where there's more, I would say it's unclear what the social hierarchy is, perhaps in the room, because everyone, like, there's no hierarchy, as everyone is sort of equal, quote unquote, and then equally there's like this culture of having consensus. So then you just get into the spiral down where this dynamic is all about, well, let's talk a bit more about it, but let's analyze a bit more. So then you kind of go from, yeah, I get it. You kind of go into this analysis paralysis mode where you, if you're not careful as a consultant, you kind of get stuck into that system. I get that. So basically your point is, which is also in the book and it's also described here in this quadrant, where it's all about what is the intervention mode that you take and what number of participants are you going to involve in the process. When you involve more people in the process, it needs to really have a clear, not perhaps over designed, but it needs to be clear what the rules of engagement are.
And I think that's really, really important, because the rules of engagement, or you know, I like to describe it, sort of the design space that you open up. I mean, I've seen so many instances where, you know, leadership teams really don't realize what design space they're opening up. They're saying, okay, we have a design team. Yeah, you have all the freedom in the world. Go ahead, take a blank sheet, draw it out. And then the design team comes back, and then the executive says, no, wait a second, no, that's not, that's out of scope, or you're not allowed to touch that. Or so really taking the time in that first stage to do some contracting on what is that design team allowed to do. What are the some call it the negotiables and non-negotiables. So what are they allowed to touch, and what aren't they allowed to touch, and what's the exact scope? So really not just saying, okay, it's the whole organization, but then what does that mean? Does that also mean, you know, the composition of the top management team? No, okay, so that's not the whole organization then. So really asking those kinds of questions in the beginning before you set a process in motion, that's really crucial.
Yeah, that really makes sense. I wholeheartedly agree. I think, you know, if you don't have that checklist ready to really go through what it is that you wanna have clarity on before you even start thinking about workshops, just like overall about the project. For sure. And then you just referred to the whole scale change, which is part of the large group interventions. So the different types of interventions that you can take. So for the listeners, there's with a conversation that I had with Paul Tulshinsky about whole scale change. So if you want to know more about that, you can tune in there. And then there's this part where you describe design ability.
Go ahead. No, I wanted to do one quick shout out, I guess, no, shout out is not the right word, but you know, so a lot of what I'm saying in terms of collaborative approaches, and I guess a lot of what Paul is saying about it is has relations to, or is based on, the work of Ed Schein. Who passed away quite recently, but his whole idea of process consultation, of you know, in short, you know, keeping the ownership of the problem with the client instead of taking ownership of their problem. That's how I would describe it in brief. So that's really the key in this whole approach. So in the expert-driven approach, you know, you take ownership of the problem more or less as a consultant, and you say, I'll solve this for you. In the collaborative approach, you don't do that. You just you know, chart a course or a process for the client to go through, in which they solve their own problem.
How do you so on that, before we move on, how do you deal with, or what would you recommend? Let's say someone who's listening right now is exploring and really wants to do more of that process consultation or process role. But deals with a customer or potential customer who has worked previously continuously with people who are more in that expert mode, or doctor patient mode, right? Like that's another role. What would you recommend there? How do you deal with that? Like sort of educating the customer to unlearn those dynamics, and reestablishing that relationship.
I guess my approach, it's not for everybody. That's also something we have to acknowledge. So
Yeah,
some
true.
clients just have a preference for expert-driven approaches,
Yeah.
and that's their prerogative. That's fine, But
Yeah.
then they shouldn't approach, some of us consultants who are more, who don't do that basically, right?
Yeah.
So I've done it in the past, but I can say I don't do that anymore. So if a client wants that, then they need to go to a different firm.
Yeah.
And I don't think, to an extent, I guess you can let them see the advantages of that, but it really depends on their starting position, right? If they are if they're not sure, then maybe you can have a
Yeah.
conversation about, this may be an approach for you. If they're squarely, based in this expert driven, and that's what they want, that's what they've had in the past, then I wouldn't even bother.
So that really means, and I do recognize that, because I think that's why I really enjoyed also when I worked at Beteschot, is this sort of ethics to it, almost like being very clear who you want to be as an org designer, and also being clear who you do not want to be. So yeah, that's a good reminder to everyone there. Cool. And then what about the design ability? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so some years ago, this was more than 10 years ago, I did a PhD in looking at design, at org design. So what I did was comparing org design to other design disciplines. And then that's where it becomes interesting, because the design ability is something that researchers have looked at in the context of other design disciplines, such as the ones I mentioned, like architecture or fashion or product design. And design ability basically, so Nigel Cross is the one that did the most of the work there, a researcher from the UK, and he basically looked at designers in labs. He had them design, and he was sort of observing, what do they do exactly. So and what they do is a number of things that are, well, the question that he doesn't really answer, or that he raises, is this something that you can learn, or is this just a talent that you have or not? But let's put that question aside.
Yeah, valid point.
Yes, so that's for another day. But what he saw was a couple of things. So one is that designers don't start by really analyzing the problem. So what they do is they start generating solutions, right? So if you, for instance, even for a building, you could get a really brief, right? A really a short introduction of what's needed, and then the designer just starts generating options, and then those options are tested, right? So, and the testing can be something very quick, like an architect might draw something in their notebook and show it to the client and say, "Is this the direction that you're looking?" No, okay, so we tested that. We go to the next one, and then it evolves, of course, into real like models of buildings and things like that, or computer simulations. But it starts out really small, and this generating solutions and testing solutions, that is something that the designer really does a lot, including also using these non-verbal media like drawings and videos and computer models. So those are some of the aspects of design ability that you can either learn or that you have to do, and that you can also use as an org designer, right? So you can generate solutions in an org design project as well. You don't have to wait until the end. You can just, and we do that in our approach very quickly, have people do some kind of, paper prototype, or have them draw out a visualization. And I don't mean an org chart, but a visualization of what they think the organization could look like. And then you can work from there and sort of iterate to a solution.
I always notice that people, it really gives them anxiety, the one part, and then other people absolutely thrive. They're like very creative, very conceptually thinking, very analytical. They see everything already in their brain, and they just start drawing, and they're just going for it. So I think it's also important to just trust that process, trust the creativity of the people, I guess. that there's always going to be something that will come out of it, but you just need to just let them just crack on and test and just go for it. Cool. And I just saw a quick note in the chat about levels of work. So Kate, thanks for your question. So let me just play back to you what my interpretation is here. Is like maybe you have a different one, but I'm reading this question as sort of job levels, job grading levels, but it could perhaps be different. So Kate, if you mean something else by that, and just drop another note.
I think it might also relate to sort of the requisite organization levels of work. So the different.
Oh yeah, so team level, organizational level, or business unit level. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and sort of the leadership levels, related to that. So well, let's answer both, right? So do you want to answer the first interpretation?
Sure.
Elliot Jacques. Okay, Elliot Jacques. Yeah, so requisite organization. So yeah, so
got it.
Interesting. So what can I say about that? It is a little bit of a it's a school of thought that's really valuable, I think. But it's also something that you either believe in it or you don't. It seems to be a little bit of the question. So people that are really a fan of this type of work see applications for it everywhere. So we need to answer both. You need to answer the first interpretation.
All right, that's fine.
But my summary would be, this says that there are different levels in an organization, and each level has a different time span. So you start at the frontline worker, who has a time span maybe of a day, of a couple of hours, and it ends up at the CEO of a multinational firm who has a time span of maybe 10 years. And there's all these levels in between, and you need to make sure that people are operating at the right level and that those levels don't get in each other's way. And that basic idea, especially the second part of it, I think is really valuable, because you see a lot of organizations where there's too many levels and the levels get into each other's way because they're both basically looking at the same time span. So that part of it is very valuable. What I think is where I don't really apply it is when you get really formal in it and you say, okay, we need to sort of almost mathematically calculate how many levels this organization has, and then translate that to different positions and how people, how suited people are to fill those positions. That's where it gets where I lose it a little bit. But but the basic idea behind it, I think, is really valuable.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. And I think also, especially when you design the details bits of an organization, it's going to be very important on how do these things coordinate with each other? How do these things, whether these levels or work, it's not necessarily about the levels per se, but more how does the work interconnect and come together, and how is that governed? I think that's where it becomes really critical, from the phases before, where you drew some fancy picture, or I don't know, like a silly looking picture, about as a visualization of the organization, because that's too conceptual, it's too high level. It needs to sort of work as well. The first interpretation, and by the way, Kate, thank you for elaborating and popping Elliot in there, because it just gave a bit more context. But in terms of the job leveling stuff, I just see that as a really different animal. It's just a different, but it's important and it's relevant, but it's a different part that I do not see as a design. It's more it's a consequence of the design, so it needs to be measured as a consequence of job design, but not something that you design for per se. When you look at the organization, especially when you look at it from an organization and a team and individual job level, it should still be about the work and not about how these are graded, how the market perceives that, what salary is attached to it. These are very important things, but this is more an expertise within the sphere, within the spectrum of HR, it's the specific expertise within HR that needs to be treated like that as well, I think, because it's not everyone can do that. Not everyone wants to do that. So, but it needs to be equally taken seriously. So I think it's it could be a separate thing that is perhaps part of the design outcome, and as part of one of the things that need to be done in order to implement. So it needs to be part of the checklist, but I don't think that it needs to be part of the org design team per se, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And I think it's the danger is that these job levels become part of the design somehow, and that's you probably remember this big project we did at a big tech firm based here in the Netherlands. Where they had all these job levels, from manager, senior manager, director, senior director, and it was at some point people were losing track of are these the levels in the organization, or are these the job levels? And those are two different things, but sometimes they become the same, and then you get these really strange structures. So I agree to keep it separate, but it's
and it,
yeah,
and it becomes, I think, a dangerous thing where people can confuse individuals with the work that needs to be designed. And I think the first principle is that you just look at the work. Don't care who sits on the chair, but you need to design that chair, right? Like, don't care whether it's you sitting on it or me or whomever. But I guess that when you have so many of those different looking chairs and you're so used to the same people sitting on them, then it's just going to be part of your perception of, oh, but we can't have an organization without those chairs with those individuals on them. And that is, I think, quite dangerous territory where you're going to undermine what is good for the organization at the expense of people pleasing, if that makes sense. That's at least how I look at it.
I mean, and that's another one of those things we came across in the survey that Nikolai and I did for what people are experiencing problems in org design projects, and one of them is this, right? So it's hard to get around the faces, the people, because everyone in the organization will start picturing who will be in that chair, right? If you're designing the chair, and that's unavoidable, but it's something you need to deal with in the design process. And I think it's also it's valid for people to be concerned about that. We need to take that seriously, and it's also valid for people to say, in some cases, in some organizations, it's very it's required, or it's important to have these different job levels. So it's not that we're saying you don't need them. It might be very important for an organization, but it's just a question of not confusing job levels with the structure you're designing in your org design project.
Yeah, absolutely. What books would you recommend? There's a question.
Yes. So let me see. I mean, there are some really classics. Well, one I would recommend. This is sort of an EODF plug, but the book club coming up with Henry Mintzberg, and his book published last year is I would really recommend. It's really easy to read. I mean, he writes in a very easy writing style, but then also he does some texts in bold. So if you just scan all the bold text in the book, and it takes you about 15 minutes, you've read the whole book.
Oh, amazing! So the book is on its way because I need to start reading it in 2 weeks' time. But this is a good recommendation.
Do that in 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, you have the highlights, and that's his service to his readers. So no, that's really a recommendation. What else? I mean, there are some classics. So Jay Galbraith, of course, wrote a lot, and some of his, even his earlier work from the 70s is still really valuable. So those are some things that I can really recommend. What else? I mean, there is a book on whole scale change. It's really hard to come by. But if if you're in the know and if you have a connection, well, Anissa will probably be able to route you to the right people. But I think there are versions available, ebook versions available of that, and that's really also really recommended.
Yeah, for sure. I would also recommend this book because since we're talking about approaches,
Yeah.
because this one has a lot of practical stuff that you can do as a consultant, as a process consultant, like what interventions you can pull for, and I think it's also connected to the whole skill change stuff. It's similar, it kind of overlaps in a way.
Role skill change somehow uses some elements of that.
Yeah, I think it was that. Like, I only have that one as a PDF, the whole skill change, because I still need to get a copy from. I need to just ask Paul to get me one. But yeah, cool. Anything we didn't cover? Actually, one thing we didn't cover, Jeroen. At the end of the chapter 6, you talk about data-driven approaches, and conscious that when you wrote it, it was like ever since a lot has changed in the world, with all of a sudden having ChatGPT and all sorts of other AI developments. So what is your reflection on that from what you've written about data-driven approaches to org design and where things are right now?
Yeah, so this is the area where I feel myself getting old or being old. So
no. Am I gonna call you a boomer now?
Yeah, you may. I'm not, but but I guess I'm probably underestimating this, right? But I think not much has fundamentally changed in terms of the way you can use these data-driven approaches or AI-based approaches as to what I wrote in the book. So there's a lot of use for it already in sort of the number crunching part or the analysis part or the running through scenarios part. There is now increasing use for it in actually replacing the designer. The designs that an AI tool can generate are increasingly sophisticated, and of course our colleague Finish Puranam is doing very interesting things in that area.
There's going to be a LinkedIn Live very soon, I think, about that as well. So that's a good plug.
Highly recommend it. And maybe that brings us back to the beginning of this conversation, that will never be a collaborative way of designing, right? So it can be, I can see it as something that you insert into a design process or that you play with in design workshops, but in the end, it will not replace a collaborative design project. I don't see how it can. So that still remains, and this is a new tool to somehow give a place in that process.
I agree. I think there's definitely opportunities, but I think we also covered that at the conference last year, where it's just there's a value of having that humanness in the room, that you feel like you're building an organization together, and that it's unique to you and not a copycat of some other organization. So that there is this spark and maybe some magic that happens when you're together in a room, I guess. So yeah, that's a good one. And Hans and Peter, thanks for your additional or added recommendations on books. It's a really good one. Yeah, I think honestly we could just make a list of all the books, but I can't come up with anything at the moment. In addition, I definitely recommend your book, like to just start to finish with where we started. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you'd like to highlight to the audience before we close?
No. I think, we could talk about this for hours, I guess. But I think for now, this was a nice conversation where we touched upon some points that even had some relation, so we're connected somehow. So I think it had some cohesion as well, even this conversation. So that's I enjoyed it a lot.
Same. Thank you. Thanks for your time, Jeroen. Thanks for those who've joined, and thank you for adding your recommendations and your questions in the chat. Really appreciate it. And see you next time.
Yeah, see you later.